Hi everyone, Stepan here. I just got home from my game, literally 5 minutes ago. And I was importing the game and doing some analysis while walking home because I was frustrated. This game was unbelievable, in my opinion, and I think it should be very instructive for you guys. So first of all, I thought I was going to be playing with the white pieces, but there was a mix-up in my team and I was not on board 1, I was on board 2. We should have changed the team compositions. So I had the wrong color for my prep. I have not been preparing with black and I don't know what my opponent plays with white. I had no idea. So when I got to the playing hall, I just found out that I have black. So anyway, d4, d5. Knight f3, knight f6, everything standard. He plays c4, I went c6, and we have the Slav, and he plays the quiet Slav. So this opening allows bishop f5. I don't want to get into too much detail here, but you cannot play knight c3 against bishop. You cannot play bishop f5 against knight c3 as easily. It's playable, but it's much sharper, and there are some complications. Against knight f3, there are no complications because on any takes queen b3, there's always queen c7, targeting the bishop on c1, gaining a tempo and defending b7. So knight c3, e6, and now by far the most common move is knight h4, just grabbing the bishop pair. I've faced this many times and I always go bishop g6, but my opponent played bishop d3. And I was unfamiliar with bishop d3, or I was familiar, but I didn't know all of it. I knew that bishop takes d3 is the most common move, but I also knew that I can get away with bishop g6, and that there are no alternatives to those two moves. I didn't want to trade pieces and develop his queen, so I went bishop g6. I think both moves should be fine. If this is taken, my rook opens up, and we get a standard sort of London system position, basically where I'm playing the London with black a tempo down, and I'm aiming for knight e4, bishop d6, and the usual attacking ideas. But my opponent didn't take, he castled. Knight bd7, standard, queen e2. Okay, he wants to play e4, and I have to stop that. So there really is only one option. If I go bishop d6 or bishop e7, then e4 happens, and I cannot hope for any sort of potential advantage in that position. It's just going to be equal. A very known structure with the pawns on d4 and c4 against the pawns on c6 and d6. So I played knight e4. And this has to be correct. Knight takes loses a piece, bishop takes leads to me having the bishop pair and a slightly compromised structure. White, of course, should play f3 immediately, and I have to take, and then white has to play e4 very quickly. And I've played a position like this one probably 100 times, so I know exactly what's coming. If f3 isn't played, then black is simply better. So f3 takes, probably knight takes, the bishop comes out, and now e4. And this is very standard, takes, pawn takes. Very standard, where I have the bishop pair, my structure is slightly compromised. The best move, if I could play it, would be to play f5 to f7, and then I have a clear advantage, but I cannot do that. Still, I have the bishop pair, and it should be about equal. However, my opponent played knight d2, which I had expected. And I could go knight f6. I could take, but then e4 once again. So I played f5. And again, I know positions like this one. I know that I can get away with f5, and I know these patterns very well. And once again, I wanted to get a complicated position. This is basically the stone wall where my bishop is not on c8, it's on g6. So it's a definite improvement. And in these setups, your main goal is to pin the knight when it comes to f3, trade off the bad bishop, and then continue from there. Of course, white is going to go f3 at some point. So my opponent took on d5, and this is a major decision. Taking with both pawns is fine. I figured that taking with the c pawn is slightly less risky, but I knew that both were okay. So for example, if e d5, then f3, I would have taken on d2, bishop d2, and knight f6, where e4 isn't easily playable. Not yet, but there could be some problems once e4 does happen. However, this pawn will be isolated, and again, it should be about equal. But I think it should be a simpler sort of equal for my opponent to navigate. So I took with the c pawn, And now this is mega complex. And once f3 happens, there are a million variations both sides have to calculate. And my opponent is about 1700 and he is about 50 or 60 years old, I want to say. So I was hoping that, you know, I would be able to outcalculate him. I do know that he plays the semi-Slav with black because I was preparing with white against him. I was going to go e4. So I know that he's comfortable with these positions with both colors. Therefore, I wanted to get this weird sort of stone wall. Okay, f3. I cannot lose a tempo, I have to take. So knight takes, b takes, and now this was my idea. This is why I took with the c pawn. I can now go queen c7 and gain a tempo on the c3 pawn. Playing e4 simply fails to queen c3, and any capture I react to with queen check and then queen takes rook. So e4 is unplayable. He played c4, which I think is a good move, and I gained another tempo with bishop d6. It's very important that I don't blunder. So for example, if instead of queen c7 I play bishop d6 and then he plays e4 and then I castle, well, I'm just losing because of check and I lose my bishop. So there were patterns, tactical patterns like this one. So queen c7 first, so that once bishop d6 comes, is defended. Okay, now I really was expecting g3. However, he played f4, and this makes every bishop on the board bad. It's just the structure is very strange, and no bishop is good at the moment. However, he doesn't really have easy access to e5 because I'm gonna go bishop h5. So I castled. He played knight f3, and of course I played bishop h5. So now if this is allowed, I really wouldn't have any chances to complicate things further. But as soon as the queen moves, I'm gonna take the knight off and be left with my good bishop. My pawns are on light squares. So he played c5. And this is an extremely committal move, which I don't think he should have played. I'm not saying he should take on d5, because that weakens e3. But if he keeps the tension, I'm never really gonna take on c4, because that brings the bishop to c4 and everything is weak. So, excuse me. So I think playing c5 is unnecessary. Okay, c5, bishop e7 only move, bishop d2. Okay, and now I thought for about 10 minutes. This is of course a classical game in 90 plus a 30-second increment. I had two plans. One of them was to get rid of the pawn immediately, but that if I take, that opens up the bishop. I was expecting pawn takes. However, it's really hard to keep that pawn, so probably white takes on b6. So b6, cb6, ab6, let's say rook fc1, queen b7. And which pawn is weaker? I have no idea. Maybe a2 is weaker, but I don't think I have anything here. Now, I did check the game with the engine after I'd finished my brief analysis, and this is better than what I did. What I did made a lot of sense to me during the game. Since e5 is going to be my square, and since there could be stuff going on these two diagonals, and I want to go bishop f6, I wanted my knight on c6 to target d4, especially since the knight's going to be traded off. So if we can imagine a knight on c6, a bishop on f6, there's always some knight takes d4, e takes, bishop takes d4, where the rook is hanging. So I played knight b8, and this is slightly inaccurate. Rook fc1. Let me just show you a random variation. I don't know. The queen moves so that the rook can take. I take, rook takes, knight c6. I'm just showing you random variations, so for white, but this is the idea. This is one of the ideas, and now if this happens, I just win the rook in the corner. So knight b8 seemed like a strategic improvement. Okay, he played rook fc1. He probably should play queen e1 immediately to get rid of the pin, and then after bishop f3, rook f3, knight c6, he can now go queen e2. And, well, maybe try to play bishop b5. Maybe try to play bishop b5 and trade off the knight. But yeah, still, maybe bishop b5 immediately is okay too, because I never have a6, b5. And if this knight reaches c6, then takes. Eventually, there's going to be a lot of pressure on b7. So let's say rook's doubled here. I never can go a6 because of rook b6, and I'll have a rook stuck on b8 and probably a rook stuck on f7. So this seemed promising to me. Instead, he played rook fc1. Knight c6, queen f1, unpinning the knight, so I take. Queen takes, bishop f6. Okay, he played rook ab1 here. A funny blunder would be rook c2, for example, trying to double on the c file. Not that there is any reason to do that, but I can now just take, and I win. So rook ab1 getting away from that makes sense. And here I was struggling for a plan. I decided to play king h8. The engine doesn't say that's the best move, but king h8 made a lot of sense to me. I wanted to play rook g8 and g5 and sort of weaken the d4 pawn. That's the idea. Or if g5 is taken, then bishop takes and e3 becomes weaker. And also knight d4 is a move if takes, bishop takes, and then a random move, knight d4, e4, bishop takes d2. So I wanted to get something like that going. Also, I wanted to double up on the g file if I could. Rook b3, and of course I'm not gonna take on d4. I don't think getting 2 pawns and the rook for knight and bishop in this position is playable at all, because this diagonal is wide open. He's left with 2 bishops for a rook. The fact that I'm 2 pawns up is irrelevant if there's a bishop on c3. I'll just get destroyed. So if, for example, I decide to win material, then yeah, I'm losing this position. I'm definitely losing. Bishop on c3, queen on d4. Maybe not queen on d4, but let's say bishop on d4, bishop on e5, queen on d4. How do I defend? And a potential passed pawn on the c file. This is losing for black. So on rook b3, I just played rook g8. He played bishop c3, preventing this pattern, 1 move too late, but I wouldn't have played it anyway, so g5. Rook cb1. Okay, I have to defend the b7 pawn. I have to. So rook ab8. And now I was expecting fg5. I thought that I had to have a big advantage on anything else. g3 simply doesn't work because I take and the pawn is pinned. So he still has to take with the e pawn. If he takes on g5, then bishop g5, and let's say bishop b5. Well, e3 is weak, but again, I don't think there's anything major for me in that position. So I think this should be better for white. The engine says +1. Instead, he played rook b2, which I couldn't understand. Maybe anticipating rook g7, rook g8. Okay, so I took on f4. If he takes with the e pawn, I think that's slightly worse than the game continuation because the queens are on the board and everything is defended and my rook is defended. And I think I'm just winning on e takes because of takes, knight takes. Now the queen is attacked, the knight's coming back to c6. The queen, very importantly, cannot reach this diagonal in a single move. So he takes with the queen. My queen is hanging, I have to trade queens, so takes, pawn takes. And now if I take immediately on d4, then I lose the b pawn, so I threw in rook g7, hoping he wouldn't see bishop a6, but he did see it. That's the only way to save material. And on bishop a6, I was really struggling to find the move. I couldn't figure out what to do. So the engine says rook b to g8 should be the best idea, and he just takes, bishop takes b7, and I play bishop takes d4 check, bishop takes d4, knight d4, and he just brings the bishop back to a6. Apparently this is equal. Okay, seems equal. I would be kind of scared to play black because this is weak and this is a passed pawn. And my knight is really unstable. If I could get the knight to e4, then that would be better. Also, the bishop is defending the queening square, so it seems incredibly dangerous. Not that I saw all of this, I didn't even consider rook bg8. I cannot take with the knight because of c6 and then b6, and I'm just busted. This I have calculated. So c6, I have, by the way, I cannot take the bishop because my rook is hanging. So b6, king f2, for example, rook f8 defending the bishop so that I can move the knight, and then rook c1. have to blockade the pawn, rook c7, I don't know, rook d1, double attacking the knight, I take on c6, but this is dreadful for me. Rook c2, there's a pin over here, I'm going to lose material. I don't have time for rook c8, knight e7. This is just very bad. So instead I took bishop d4. And bishop d4, knight d4, and we exchange everything on b7. Rook b7, rook b7, rook b7, rook b7, bishop b7. Now here's the issue. He's just gonna queen this pawn. So I don't have time for knight e2 check, knight takes f4, which is what I had intended to do originally, and I thought this was just winning. If I do this, my opponent queens, so I have to play knight b5. And it's at this point that I realized that this endgame is completely losing. And that's not an exaggeration. This is completely losing. There's nothing I can do. But I fought on. King f2, king g7, king e3, king f6, bishop c8. I don't understand bishop c8. That's a pretty bad move. I don't know. I don't know what bishop c8 was about. I mean, he should have just gone a4, chasing my knight away, and when my knight moves away, then king d4. And the only move I have is king e7, probably, and then just h3, g4, and there are too many passed pawns. Let's say I stop that. Now the bishop can just eventually come back and win the pawn. So a4 was the simplest one. Instead, bishop c8 wastes a bit of time. King e7, okay, bishop a6, knight c7. Knight c7 is a very bad move. I thought this was the only move. Apparently, bishop a6 is so bad, and I can draw this endgame now, which I didn't see with knight c3. And this attacks the pawn. If a3, I go knight b1, and then if, let's say, the pawn is saved again, then I go knight c3 again. If bishop b5, I can start marching my king over here, and he doesn't have a way to save the pawn and the bishop. If king d8, bishop c6, then I just approach the bishop and threaten to win the pawn. So let's say king d8, king d4. Believe it or not, this is a draw. I have visualized a position like this one, and I just figured this was completely losing. But then again, I obviously don't know anything about endgames. I thought, okay, passed pawn here, how do I stop these two pawns? I couldn't see it. Apparently this is a draw, and this is a great exercise for you guys to figure out. I haven't managed to analyze this in detail yet, but I definitely will. I still would bet anything that white is winning, but okay. Instead of that, I played knight c7, and this is losing according to the engine. Okay, bishop d3. In my mind, after a4, I can never take on the bishop on b5. And here's the issue. I'm in complete Zugzwang. I cannot reach c6 and take the pawn because my king's going to have to move away, because if my knight moves away, the king wins the e-pawn. That's why it's game over. So king d7, king d4, h6. I was afraid of g4, and after fg4, bishop takes, where my pawn is just going to be lost once the bishop drops back to e2. So for example here, what I do, I cannot defend. So if I take, takes, and then back and wins the pawn. That's why I played h6. a4, king c6, and now with bishop b5 I can just take. So he just wastes a tempo, and I cannot move anything. Moving the knight doesn't do anything. Moving the king allows bishop b5, which in my mind was losing. And if you turn on the engine, I played king d7. If bishop b5, I can take that once again and go into the same drawn king and pawn endgame. Okay, so g4 is coming. My opponent has a passed pawn. He played g4. I took fg4, hg4, and now king e7. I have to come closer because the g-pawn is going to queen. King e5. Okay, I only have one move, knight e8. And he plays f5. And I went from 30 minutes to 15 minutes here, and I really did want to resign because I couldn't see a single idea. Here's the problem. If I take on f5, he takes with the g pawn, and I'm completely losing. So takes. Let's say I try to defend my pawn, set up a blockade, he just plays c6. And that's it. And my king is overworked. My knight doesn't have a single square, and I'm in complete zugzwang. Let's say I try knight g4 check, king takes d5. So what? Knight f6, king c5, and I'm busted. King moves, the king enters, knight moves. I mean, whatever happens, it's completely losing. So on f5, my main candidate move was knight f6. And takes, knight g4 check, king d5, h5. This is what I wanted to do. But then I saw bishop e2, knight f6 check, king c6, resigns. I cannot take on e6. King e6, king b7, and bye-bye. That's it. And then I thought, okay, if I take on f5 and he takes with the bishop or with the king, maybe I can save the game. Why? Because he isn't threatening c6 and f6 check. So I basically don't have to blockade the f pawn. Instead of playing knight f6, I can delay losing with knight c7. So I took on f5, hoping that he takes with anything other than the g pawn. And in about 10 seconds, he takes with the king. I was so happy. I'm sure this is still losing. Okay, let's see. The engine says plus 2.7, so it's still losing. But it's much easier to try and draw. If pawn takes, it's hopeless. So I played king f7, preventing king g6. He played king e5, I played king e7. Okay, he cannot really take the pawn, at least that's what I thought, because of knight f6. Well, he can take the pawn. Luckily, he didn't. Taking the pawn is winning. And that much I managed to calculate after I played king e7 and before he made his move. If king takes, then knight f6 check, king c6, knight g4, king b7 resigns. I've no way of reaching the pawn in time. If knight f6, c6, knight e8, for example, he just plays c7. And that's it. I'm just losing. Instead of that, he played c6. Okay, a bit of hope. Knight c7. The pawn isn't moving forward. Bishop e2. Knight e6. Now with king d5, I play knight f4 check, and I'm fine. So bishop f3. And now I felt really happy. d4. Now I think this is close to a draw for humans. Unfortunately, there's still one more move that enables him to get a better position. And I was really afraid that he was going to go bishop e4 here, because once again, I'm in zugzwang. And after knight c7, king d4, king d6, I think I'm fine, but I wasn't sure. This is very hard to play. The engine says 0, but I'm not sure I would have drawn this position. Instead, he played bishop d1, and now this is a very easy draw. And I actually offered the draw and he declined. I offered the draw on my next move. I played d3 and offered the draw. He declined, and we played it out for a few more moves. So obviously king e4. I cannot go knight c5 check and win the a pawn because it's defended. One very important thing to note here is that he has a passed a pawn, and it's the light squared bishop, so this is the correct corner. If instead of the a pawn, the situation was reverse, let's say a pawn on h3, and the pawn on b4, then if I leave his h-pawn on the board, it's just a draw if my king is close enough, but that doesn't work for this corner. So I don't play knight c5, I just go king d6 and easy draw. King d3, king c6. He's gonna win my h-pawn, but that doesn't matter. I approach close, I come close enough. First of all, I don't play king e7, that's an unnecessary move. I want my king either here or here, to make sure I'm blockading the g-pawn. So I just played a5, forcing him to waste the tempo. He doesn't have to, he can play king f6, but I can just wait with king d5. Or sorry, on king f6, yeah, okay, maybe I can go knight c5 now. So king g6, king e5, he played bishop b3. If he takes this pawn, which is the critical line, then I go either king here or king here. I think this is more precise. And there simply is no way to make progress because my knight's going to be on g5 and then hop around any of these squares, covering the square twice. And once the king moves away, my king is going to blockade this pawn. So instead of that, he played bishop b3. Now I can throw in a tempo move, knight c5, bishop c2, and after king f4, he actually offered the draw and we agreed to a draw. This is just, it's a dead draw. Of course, if, I don't know, if king takes, then I can take here. And on bishop takes, king takes, and if the pawn advances, then I'm in time to stop the pawn. Well, actually, am I? Because he has bishop. Huh. Okay, not here, not that. I actually have to pay attention to this. Oh yeah, I'm stupid. I don't take here. I just take with the king on g4 first, and then I take on a4. Stupid. And it's an easy draw. So yeah, this was my game. I cannot believe what I managed to save. This was so losing that it was hopeless. This once again shows that you shouldn't resign before it's actually game over. Obviously, I'm not happy I salvaged the draw against the 1700 player, but I guess that's better than losing. We did win the match, so that's a good thing. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.